Okay, so moving on to our next presentation, we have a few folks with us today from Vancouver Coastal Health. So I'm going to bring on the line here. We have Emily Peterson and Meghan Strait. You can go ahead and join. And I believe also Vancouver Coastal Health Medical Health Officer, Dr. Michael Schwant, will be joining as well. Emily Peterson is an environmental health specialist with Vancouver Coastal Health, and Meghan Strait is Extreme Heat Check and Support Project Lead, which is a lot about what we're going to be talking about today with Vancouver Coastal Health. And, talking about extreme heat, 2021's, obvious record-breaking extreme heat events really highlighted the need for increased vigilance in protecting vulnerable individuals. Both Emily and Meghan are going to, from Vancouver Coastal Health, are going to kind of discuss the various ways that rental housing providers can proactively assist those vulnerable tenants. There will be a Q&A at the end, so just as with all the other sessions, please do get your questions in, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end. And without anything else from me, I'll pass it over to Emily and Meghan. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. So we have quite a few slides that we're going to be presenting today. So Megan's going to bring those up on the screen, and we're going to split the presentation in half. So I'll start off, and Meghan will then continue on with some of the fantastic work that she's been doing. So I just wanted to, before we begin, thank our colleagues, Dr. Michael Schwant, Emily Newhouse, Dr. Sarah Henderson, who's at the BC Centre for Disease Control, and Brianna Gregory, who's at Health Emergency Management BC, for their contributions to these slides. Next slide, please, Meghan. So I'm speaking today on the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, and this includes the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I encourage everyone to think about the territories of the lands that they're sitting on as we put this slide up. Next slide, please, Meghan. So we've got quite a packed agenda for us here. So Meghan and I are going to try and get through it in 30 minutes. We've got some information on the heat events from last summer and learnings from last summer. We're going to provide information on heat vulnerable people and spaces. We'll provide some information that's coming out on evidence-based recommendations for cooling people and also for cooling spaces. And then Meghan is really going to get into the information on life-saving actions that housing providers can take during extreme heat events, and talk about our check-in guide and our toolkit that we have. Next slide, please. So to start off this conversation, I just wanted to remind us all of the event of June 2021, which I'm sure most people on this call, if you were in BC, you would remember this event very well. We experienced historic heat. All-time temperature records were broken across BC and were quite high for a number of days from the end of June through into the beginning of July. And this is just some of the temperature records that were broken. And for anyone that lives in the area and in BC, you'll recognize that these temperatures were many degrees higher than anything that we typically experience in the summer here in BC. Next slide, please. So before I get into the absolutely devastating and catastrophic effects from that heat event, I wanted to bring forward the importance of greenhouse gas reductions. So this event was not possible without our changing climate. And as our climate continues to change, we're going to see more events similar to this one. So reducing greenhouse gases is going to be necessary to prevent these events from getting worse as our climate changes. So just quickly here, you can see this model. I won't go into the details about this modeling, but the blue line here is a goal, I would say, that we would like to see in terms of warming. So you can see the temperature change on the left here, and then on the bottom it's the dates, and you can see that as we move forward, our temperature changes are expected to get more significant, and depending on our GHG reductions, we can determine how much temperature change we're going to see, across the region. So the blue line is ideally what we'd like to see, an increase in temperatures, but then of course a stabilization if we reduce GHGs right now. The orange line there is potentially where we could be heading with our GHG emissions at this point. And then the red line there is kind of the worst case scenario. So if we don't reduce emissions at this point, we can expect to see very significant warming and very significant climate and health impacts across the region. So this emphasizes that we must quickly move away from fossil fuel combustion towards cleaner, low GHG energy sources, such as electrification. And for buildings, if we're talking about buildings, this could mean installing heat pumps and using electricity to power those heat pumps. Please go ahead, Meghan, next slide. So in the heat event of last summer, we saw an estimated 740 excess deaths between June 25th and July 2nd. So many people will have heard about the coroner's report that came out recently. This document actually shows, this slide here shows analysis from the BC Centre for Disease Control. And that analysis looks at the amount of deaths we can expect to see in the province on a day-to-day basis, and then how many deaths were actually observed during that period of time. And what you can see here in this red bar here is that we saw a dramatic increase in mortality during this heat event. The dotted line here shows us the hottest day of the event in terms of outdoor temperatures, but you will notice that excess mortality actually still increased after the hottest day of the event. And that's not uncommon for heat events. And it may largely be due to indoor temperatures when you see high indoor temperatures during the hottest day and also on the days afterwards, as it takes a while for indoor temperatures to drop back down. Next slide, please. So in the June 2021 heat event, we've heard a lot in the media about how the most impacted were older adults, those 50 plus, and you can see in the blue chart here that as age increased, the estimated number of excess deaths increased. We also saw that most of these deaths occurred in the community. So they didn't occur in care settings, so acute care settings as much. They didn't occur as much in residential care settings, but a huge number of these excess deaths occurred in the community settings, so in people's homes. Next slide, please. The evidence from the BC Centre for Disease Control suggested that the risk factors for death during this event were people that were living with social isolation, people who were living with deprivation, people who experienced mental illness, substance use, and comorbid illness as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. As well, individuals who live in communities with privilege, have access to green space and tree canopy coverage, and are in care seem to be more protected during this event. Please, next slide, Meghan. So the BC Coroner's Extreme Heat Death Review, which was released last week, pointed out that 56% of the deaths that they investigated lived alone, and 98% of these deaths occurred indoors in a residence. And so A very large chunk of these were in private multi-unit buildings and also in private detached buildings. There was also deaths seen in social housing and SROs and supportive housing and other residences as well. So this is a really important piece to think as we're moving forward about how we can protect the individuals who are in their homes and who live alone, especially in those who may be more at risk. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk a little bit about the heat vulnerable people and the spaces as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about 3 factors that impact heat vulnerability, and the first is the individual risk factors, which includes age and medical conditions. So as we saw, older adults are at more risk for heat illness and death, as well as people with pre-existing health conditions, and that may be cardiovascular or respiratory diseases, certain medications, individuals who are confined to a bed or need help with self-care, or individuals who may have sensory or other communication impairments may be at particular risk during these heat events. As well, the BC CDC found that people who are experiencing mental illness were at higher risk, as well as people who have substance use disorders. Next slide. So social isolation is the next piece that I want to talk about. And so the individual risk factors are one piece, but social vulnerability is also a really important piece to heat mortality. So people who live alone are socially isolated and have barriers to reaching help, whether that's not having a huge social network to check in on them, or having limited mobility and not able to walk to a cooling center or find a way to get to a cooling center, are particularly at risk. And this includes individuals who have reduced access to cooling facilities and other heat mitigation measures, such as air conditioning in their units, or being able to access, cooling centers or other cool spaces such as malls and libraries. We've also seen that the socially vulnerable groups may also be more likely to live in neighborhoods with environmental vulnerability. And I'm going to go to the next slide, Megan, please, and talk a little bit about environmental vulnerability. So research shows that areas with sparse vegetation, darkly hued roofs and paving materials, so really our dense urban environments, and lack of shading in the neighborhoods lead to a higher urban heat island, and you have higher temperatures in these areas than you would in other parts of our urban environments. Next slide, please, Megan. So this here explains the urban heat island effect for those of you who are not familiar with it, which is that we see much higher temperatures in urban cores and in urban environments where we don't have vegetation than we do in rural environments or suburban environments with high tree canopy coverage. And the map here on the right-hand side shows you land surface temperatures across the region, gives you an example of this urban heat island effect. So we see that the areas with parks or green spaces or good tree canopy coverage have lower temperatures than those in other areas. Next slide, Megan. So we also have found that there's some building risk factors. The BC CDC, thank you for this work, has put this slide together, and of course buildings with no cooling, no air conditioning or active cooling, units that are on higher floors of buildings, those that are directly under the roof or south or west facing windows, units with large window areas and with single pane windows are particularly at risk, and also units with no external window shading. So external window shading is extremely important to reduce temperatures indoors, and many buildings do not have external window shading at this point. But when you pull the blinds inside a unit, It does provide some impact on temperature, but you can still get some heat gain from those blinds heating up. Whereas if you have external window shading, then that blocks the light from entering the unit at all, and can really reduce heat inside the unit. And then, of course, units with no cross breeze and also little vegetation are impacted as well. Next slide, please. So I'll just talk a little bit about some evidence-based recommendations for cooling people and also cooling spaces. So next slide, please, Megan. So before I get into that, I just wanted to ensure that everyone is aware there was a media release about this last week, that BC is moving to a two-tiered heat alert response system starting this summer. And that's going to have two criteria, a heat warning criteria and an extreme heat emergency criteria. And so the differences between these are largely based on public health risk. So in a heat warning, the public health risk is moderate, whereas during an extreme heat emergency, we see extremely very high public health risk and dangerously hot levels. And in terms of historic frequency for heat warnings, we see about 1 to 3 of them per summer, whereas in extreme heat emergency, you're expecting more like 1 or 2 of them per decade, which would be from the event that we experienced last summer, and also an event in 2009 are 2 examples of that. Okay, next slide, please, Megan. So when we're experiencing these events, it's important to ensure that we take measures to keep our indoor environments cool, and then also measures to cool individuals during these events. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really the indoor temperatures that matter, and it's really the indoor temperatures in an individual's residence that matter. And these temperatures can peak much later in the day than outdoor temperatures, and then it can also stay high after the peak of the heat event in terms of the number of days past that. So strategies to keep units cool, of course, are using heat pumps to cool the units, using external window shading or external window films, you know, closing shades and blinds to block the sun, closing windows during the day at approximately 10 a.m. and then opening them overnight. So this is a really important piece that I think many people may not understand, but you really want to try and trap the cooler air into the unit during the daytime, and then open them up overnight when the temperatures start to drop again, to then bring in cool air into the unit. We also want to work hard to move, to use fans to move cooler air into the unit overnight. So putting those fans in the windows or near doors to bring cooler air into the units. And then, of course, increasing site tree coverage if possible. Next slide, please. So actions that individuals can take to stay cool include going to spaces I'd mentioned, like malls or recreation centers, taking cool showers or putting a part of the body in cool water throughout the day. The evidence is quite clear that this can be effective in cooling temperatures in individuals. Wearing a wet shirt, applying damp towels to the skin, of course, drinking plenty of water and other liquids before you feel thirsty. Wearing loose fitting and light colored clothing that's breathable, ensuring that's appropriate for the weather. And then monitoring indoor temperatures and checking in on individuals who may be more susceptible to heat health impacts. And this includes looking for signs of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Next slide, please, Megan. I just quickly wanted to make a note on fans, because I think this information is new for many and it's new for us as well. It's based on emerging evidence. And it's important to note that fans do not actually lower body temperatures. And so we shouldn't be relying on fans as our primary cooling method. Fans are much more useful when it comes to strategically moving cooler air into the home overnight, or from areas of cooler areas to maybe areas where people are. But they're not effective at lowering body temperature, and they may actually give an individual kind of a false sense of security. When you have a fan blowing on you, you feel like a little bit better, But your body temperature may not actually be reduced, especially in those high risk older adults. Next slide, please, Megan. So during an extreme heat emergency, these are the extreme events that I was talking about in the two-tiered alerting system. Indoor environments without effective air conditioning may become dangerously hot, and they may become dangerously hot during a heat warning as well, depending on, of course, the building and other factors. But they're more likely to become quite dangerously hot during an extreme heat emergency when temperatures are very high outside. So there's some important things to keep in mind with units with indoor temperatures, in that when we're looking at emerging research that's just coming out of the University of Ottawa, we see that around 26 degrees and below is a relatively safe indoor temperature. 26 to 31 degrees inside, it may pose a risk to the most susceptible individuals. And then really sustained exposure to temperatures above 31 degrees should be avoided for those individuals who are most susceptible to heat. And there should be considerations about ensuring that these individuals are checked in quite regularly, or that they're ideally moved out of these dangerously hot environments into cooler environments. And it's just important to remember that indoor temperatures can peak around 8 p.m. and they may stay dangerous overnight if the unit is not able to cool down overnight. Next slide, please, Megan. So Megan's going to go forward with the life-saving actions that rental housing providers can take.
Great, thanks, Emily. So yeah, we wanted to share some ideas and actions about that rental housing providers may take to improve the safety of their residents. We understand that this may not all be feasible given capacity or the setting that you're working in, but we thought it was important to share some ideas and some recommendations that have come out through the latest evidence. And it's also an opportunity today to talk about heat preparedness and also give you folks a chance to ask questions as well after our session, so you kind of understand why some of these recommendations are coming forward. So pre-season, these are actions you can take right now, actually, because we are pre-season, right? I know it's quite cold out today, but this is actually typically a sort of a hotter period of the year, right? So these are the steps you can take to prepare for any coming heat warnings or extreme heat events that we might be having this summer, and a chance to prepare your tenants and potentially also the space that you operate. So things you can do are distributing and displaying pre-season resources. That might be prepared BC guides that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, maybe the heat posters BCH has that share about ways to cool spaces and people, or maybe even checking in with tenants to see if they want some additional support during heat emergencies, sort of through notices in their mail slot, what have you. You can also encourage tenant neighbors to sort of create relationships, maybe even finding a heat buddy. You know, if you notice that neighbors are friends, maybe sort of asking them about heat, like, hey, have you guys seen those heat resources? Maybe you can look out for each other during a heat event. Also trying to remove barriers within buildings that would reduce the chance to cool buildings and spaces. So for example, units that might have rules around air conditioning or covering windows, trying to reduce or remove those rules, or maybe even just for heat events, and actually making sure that that's advertised throughout the building, so that tenants actually know that that's an option for them during a heat warning. Also trying to share information about cooled spaces in the neighborhood. So can you post information about the nearby cooling center in the rec room or the rec center, or malls that have air conditioning, so that's something you can post in the building. Trying to learn about heat check-ins potentially. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Maybe that's something that you'd feel comfortable doing in your building, and sort of trying to help the residents out with. Also looking for options for transportation to cooling. Is there people within the building that would be able to transport folks that have mobility challenges? Also trying to prepare communication for a heat warning. So thinking ahead to the summer, if a heat warning arrives and you're busy, can you have some of these resources printed out and prepared, ready to post in that situation? Also looking around your unit, like is there, or the building or wherever you operate, is there spaces that you could potentially look at creating a cool space, or a space for clean air if there's wildfire smoke? So steps you can take during a heat warning. So if Environment Canada and Climate Change Canada declares a heat warning, it's important to try to monitor weather throughout the summer so you can know when these are warnings are happening. We'll talk about some weather apps and sources later. If you hear these warnings coming out, trying to display those heat resources that we talked about. So heat posters, sharing about cooling sites, things that are in the area that tenants can access. Also trying to look at those temporary cooled spaces. Those are something you can set up either in the building, like is there a common room that could potentially have air conditioning rolled into it, portable air conditioning? You know, could you set up something outside? You know, is there a cool kind of treed area nearby the building that could be a shared cool space that tenants could access? And then also trying to assist tenants if that's feasible for you. So you think of, you know, people who have mobility challenges may struggle to try to put coverings on their windows or making modifications to their space. So maybe that's something that they could have assistance with. Or even looking at trying to transport residents who have challenges with mobility, trying to get them to those cooler spaces in the community. So steps you can take during an extreme heat emergency. So like Emily had mentioned, this is the much more severe situation, right? So this is where we're most likely to have the greatest risk of death for heat vulnerable people. So folks that are more at risk, like Emily mentioned, or also folks that are in higher risk environments that would be quite a bit hotter. So these are steps that we really want to try to take to reduce the chances of people dying. So all of those previous steps that we talked about in a heat warning would be applicable here, but also trying to increase notices and messaging about the dangers. So trying to put notices up, helping people understand that this is not just sort of a hot day. There's actually a really severe risk of or life-threatening risk that's happening right now. Trying to potentially engage in check-ins on tenants, or encouraging neighbors to check in on one another. And then if you've been able to open up a shared cool space in your facility, potentially expanding the hours. So is that something that could stay open overnight or even later into the evening? Emily had mentioned that, it can be hot even overnight during these extreme heat emergencies, and those temperatures can still remain very dangerous overnight for high-risk tenants. So I mentioned a little bit about heat check-ins, so I thought we'd talk a bit about these just in case it's something that you were interested in or you wanted to talk to tenants about. So maybe they'd want to do check-ins for their neighbors. So what is a heat check-in? Really, it's a visit or maybe a call or a text to someone who could be heat vulnerable, just to check on how the safety of their home environment, and then also if they show any signs of heat stress, so sort of heat-related illnesses, which we'll go through some symptoms in a second, and then also if they need help. And then who can do a heat check-in? Basically anyone. So it doesn't require health training. We've created some resources. So have the BC Centre for Disease Control that are designed for people in the community who don't have health training, and try to walk them through the steps of checking on someone to see how they're doing. Who should we be checking on? It's really those heat vulnerable people, like Emily had mentioned, who are the priority. So people who are older, who have multiple medical conditions, people who have mental health challenges or use substances, for example. And then also people who have multiple risk factors would be at even higher risk, especially those that are socially isolated. So, when do we start a check-in? So really it would be best to start a check-in during a heat warming, or if you really don't have capacity, at the very least, extreme heat emergencies are the ones that would be very important to try to look at doing check-ins or trying to encourage neighbors to check on one another. Like we mentioned, those are the ones that have the highest risk of death. When would you potentially end check-in? So like Emily had mentioned, it's heat vulnerable people may be at risk even after heat alert has ended. When temperatures are high overnight, there isn't really a chance for the body to recover. So this cumulative effect of heat, so people being exposed to high temperatures all throughout the day, all throughout the night for multiple days at a time, this cumulative effect of heat can have a severe impact potentially on heat vulnerable people, and it may worsen pre-existing health conditions. So even if the temperatures start to go down after a heat warming, they still may be recovering from this cumulative effect of heat and may still be impacted at it, may still be at high risk. Also, heat vulnerable people may take longer to cool their body fully. So even if you're like, okay, I'm starting to feel better after this heat warning, I've cooled down, keep in mind that certain sort of medical conditions, for example, may impact people's ability to cool their body. So the other people may still be trying to recover from a heat warning. Frequency, so the very least, and the most important thing is to try to have a check-in at least once a day, regardless of the time. If you have some flexibility on when you can check in, there's sort of pros and cons to different times of the day. Morning check-ins may be a chance to sort of assess the person, assess their space, and maybe make modifications or provide education that could potentially prevent them from getting worse throughout the day and experiencing that heat-related illness. Checking later on in the day, though, may also be helpful because those are those much higher temperatures Emily had mentioned. That's when the risk could potentially be higher. So checking on someone when there is that risk might actually be useful to know, if they are in danger. So sort of pros and cons to both. Also keeping in mind that during an extreme heat emergency or for people who have multiple risk factors, trying to increase the frequency of check-ins to multiple times a day if that's possible. So how do we do a heat check-in? We've got this guide that we put together. It's part of our VCH extreme heat check-in framework we put together for NGOs, so non-governmental organizations, but it's also applicable to people running facilities, for example. So this is something that you could be looking at as well. It goes through kind of steps to assess a person individually and as well as their space. So looking at things like heat-related illness, do they have skin rashes, heavy sweating, dizziness, nausea or vomiting, rapid breathing or heart rate, body temperatures over 38 degrees, headaches, difficulty concentrating, muscle cramps, extreme thirst, dark urine or decreased urination. Those are times when we're wanting to start cooling someone. So like Emily had mentioned, taking all those steps to cool someone off, maybe removing them from that hot environment. Those are our signs of heat exhaustion. If we're starting to see more neurological symptoms, so things like fainting, decreased consciousness, confusion, lack of coordination, or very hot and red skin, then that's when we're worried about something called heat stroke. It's an emergency. It's important to call 911 if you see anyone experiencing any of these signs and symptoms, and to move them out of a cool space if that's possible, and begin cooling them as soon as possible. So this flow chart of sort of how to check on someone is on our website, and we'll share that link afterwards. So like I mentioned, we have our heat framework that you can access. It is on our website. It goes through kind of generally how to run a check-in if you were interested in doing that, answers to common questions, tools that you can carry, things like that. So there's a number of other resources that we wanted to mention that could be helpful for you throughout the heat season. There's the Prepared BC guide, and this is good for like neighbors, tenants. It kind of walks through how to make a plan, how to assess your home, and also how to find a heat buddy. So really how to prepare for these extreme heat events. There's also information from the BC CDC, Center for Disease Control, and that's going through how to do a check-in as well. That should hopefully be coming out soon. And then BC Housing has some fantastic resources for people who are operating buildings. Theirs are more from the nonprofit side, but it could still be applicable to folks like yourselves. There's wellness check-in cards for tenants. So if you're wanting to check on people, this is something you could maybe adapt and post it on their door, potentially put through the mail slot to sort of say, hey, here's some things to think about in heat. We did try to check in on you. Maybe give me a call back at this number just so I know that you're doing okay. We also have our VCH heat posters that are posted on our website that you can access. They're translated as well, or they will be translated soon, so you can put those up within your building. We have a letter that's gone out to people like yourselves that are operating buildings. That's something we can provide sort of to LandlordBC. I think it might have already gone out, and share with you folks after. And there's also BC CDC wildfire smoke information that's helpful if we experience that this summer. As I mentioned, there's sort of weather, different weather sources that you can access. These are all through Environment Canada and Climate Change Canada. So there are official weather sources. So this is really what we recommend for looking at weather throughout the summer. There's the public weather alert. So any of those notifications about heat warnings or extreme heat emergencies will be posted here. There's also the Weather Can app that you can download that will notify you of these alerts and emergencies. There's also Hello Weather for folks that don't have phones or internet access, or don't have apps, for example, or just might have a normal landline, don't have internet access. Hello Weather is a phone-in line that they can call and get weather information for their specific area, and it can also give them information about sort of hazards, warnings that have come out, things like that. Thanks so much, folks. That's sort of what we had for you today. Hopefully we can kind of answer some questions, and we will be sharing resources with Hunter as well to sort of pass out afterwards as well. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Thank you both, Emily and Megan. I know that we have some questions that I'm sure that are going to come in. As we had kind of previously discussed, I'm going to just provide a bit of extra information about those check-ins. So in the conversations that kind of led up to us having Megan and Emily join us today, we talked about the legality of entering someone's unit to conduct one of these checks. And the Act provides some grounds for landlords to enter the units in kind of certain extreme situations without giving proper notice. So if you're just going in to kind of talk to the tenant and inform them of things, then you should knock on the door and ask them if you can enter, and hopefully they you can have that conversation. But however, if there is an extreme heat event and something happens and you can't hear can't hear them in there, but you know that they're in their apartment, they're not coming to the door, and you're concerned because you know that perhaps that they do kind of meet that criteria for being someone who is perhaps more susceptible or vulnerable. You have the right, and really in some cases, I guess could also be argued the duty to enter the tenant's unit just to check. So the Act allows landlords to enter a tenant's unit if they feel that there is an emergency. So if we look at what that could look like I said, if you know that the tenant is potentially vulnerable and for a fact that they are at home, you might end up having to enter the tenant's unit. You need to use your judgment on that. It is really important that you're only entering a tenant's unit without notice if an emergency really exists and it's protect life or property. And if you enter the tenant's unit and it turns out they were just taking a nap and they didn't want to get up, it's going to be embarrassing. Obviously, it'll be an awkward situation for likely everyone involved. But so long as you exercised, your kind of due diligence in assessing the situation, it's not generally going to be an issue from a residential tenancy branch and residential tenancy act standpoint. So it's something to know that as a landlord, you are empowered to do that through the legislation. They specifically, put that into the legislation to say you can enter for purposes of assess, if there's an emergency. So just to, like I said, as kind of part of our kind of conversation that led up to that was a big part of what we were wanting to talk about. So just going to some of the questions here, you mentioned some of these resources. Are they currently available? I think specifically around like the posters about heat events and kind of precautions that people should take.
Definitely, yep, they're all up on our website right now. That heat poster specifically is going through translation, so give us hopefully a little bit longer to get that translated, but the basic English one is posted. It's www.vch.ca/heat. There's a number of different resources. The other piece that I shared as well about that check-in workflow is also up there, so there's a bunch of different things you can access from that site.
Yeah, and to our the people who are on the call, we will of course be sharing all those resources in the email that goes out along with the recording of today's session. So those resources will be available, and also throughout the summer as we continue to kind of monitor this potential issue, and we know that it's likely to become more frequent. Fingers crossed we don't have anything this year, but nonetheless, this is something that we all need to be aware of for future years as well. So we'll continue to provide those resources. Just a reminder to anyone who's here, if you have questions, get them into the Q&A. So an interesting point kind of was made, and I wanted to just go back to it. Emily, you mentioned, and this was I was listening, and it was a great presentation in general, but that point kind of made me go, oh, my whole life is a lie. Fans don't work. So can we just revisit that? So just
Sure.
you know, what people should be using fans for, because I used them
Yeah,
wrong my whole life. So
yeah, and to be honest, I think most of us have, right? Um, so the recent evidence suggests, particularly for individuals that are at risk, so older adults, and particularly during, you know, quite high temperatures, fans are actually not effective in reducing body temperature. So they can make someone feel a bit cooler, but when it comes to reducing body temperature, which is what we need to do to prevent heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and mortality, fans are not effective for doing that. So what we recommend using fans for is for moving air around the space and trying to cool the space. And so that includes putting them in windows if you can, or doors, and bring that cool air in overnight, all night long. You know, using your bathroom fans and your kitchen fans, turn those on. They'll vent out while you have the fans coming in the windows to bring that cooler air in. You know, using that to try and make your space as cool as possible, because if your space cools down, then your body will cool down. And then when we're really looking to think about cooling the body throughout the day during these heat events, we're recommending looking to water. And so if you're you know, of course, going to cool spaces is really important, and accessing these cool spaces. But if we can't, and we're quite hot, that's when it comes into using water to cool the body. So you know, to reduce body temperatures, putting your legs or feet or your entire body in a cool bath, or taking a cool shower, those can be effective to reduce body temperature.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's something that I think that everyone who's on the call learned today, that fans don't cool us off. We probably all knew that, like empirically, we probably all kind of realized it wasn't actually cooling us off, but it was nice to live in that lie. So that's great. So looking at you know, kind of again keeping units cooled, and specifically when it comes to the vulnerable populations, you mentioned a few kind of strategies for that, including you know, kind of ensuring that you know, light isn't getting in during those kind of peak times, you know, especially from larger windows. So, you know, what are some kind of techniques on that, just to look for, and how can we help those people who maybe have mobility issues that can't?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so really, the best way to cool a unit, of course, is to have air conditioning in that unit, and heat pumps is a technology that could be used for air conditioning. But when you don't have air conditioning in that unit, ensuring that the unit is, you know, you're blocking the daylight sun in that unit, that you're closing the windows in the daytime, which I think is, to some people, it seems counterproductive, because you think, oh, you have your window open, it's cooling. But if the temperatures outside are getting higher than the temperatures in your unit, which usually happens around, 10 a.m., then you really need to close the windows and doors and close all the shades and try and trap that cooler air in the unit until the temperatures outdoors start to cool off again. So I think that's another key piece of information that people may. I mean, I didn't do it before a couple years ago, so I was not fully aware of that, and I think that's a key piece of information for individuals to think about in their units.
The other piece, oh, sorry, go ahead, Emily.
No, you please go ahead, Megan.
The other piece I was thinking too, just with the windows that sometimes we mentioned that we didn't get to today, is that often folks are kind of wondering, what do we do when there's both smoke and heat? Do we open the windows? Do we close the windows? I don't have anything to filter the air. The risk is generally speaking higher for heat events. So we do recommend prioritizing trying to cool yourself versus trying to keep the smoke out. So if it comes down to, I got to open the windows, but that's going to smoke or bring the smoke in overnight, we do still recommend trying to cool yourself over trying to, stay away from the smoke. Hopefully everyone can in future access sort of both cool and clean air spaces, but for now, that is sort of how we recommend prioritizing things.
Yeah, thanks for that, Megan. And just when we're talking about clean air spaces, it's a really great point. What we recommend is trying to pair cooling in the space, so air conditioning, with HEPA filtration. So those HEPA filtration units in the space as well to keep the air both cool and clean. But we recognize that many people, and most people really across the region, don't have access to that.
Certainly. Well, I mean, yeah, we live in a region where, growing up, most of us, if you grew up in BC, we don't need air conditioning. That's something for Ontario, and pretty much everywhere else. But we live in this great place that doesn't need this, and we're proving that wrong. Well, this is really great information for our members. Our CEO is, of course, David Hutniak is also here on the call. I just wanted to make sure that he provided some feedback here. Of course, we provided information and support to our members last year during the heat dome to help prepare really as best as could be done to support their residents. But what you've laid out today really kind of builds on that really quite significantly, and is a great and excellent resource to enhance the supports that we've done in the past. Should we experience a heat event again in the future. So again, that's just a thank you from our CEO, David Hutniak. I think with that, we will call that to an end. Thank you, everyone, for all of our attendees, for your attention and for your questions today. Just a reminder, of course, the recording will go out. So if you miss something, don't worry, you'll get that information along with all the contact information and resources that were shared today as well. Again, thank you to our event sponsors, FortisBC, who made it possible for us to share this event with our members free. And thank you to Emily and Megan for this great information. Thank you.
Thanks for having us and for hosting this.
Yes, thank you. Bye.